Welcome to DataSpot podcast. I'm your host Swapnil, and this is the seventh episode. In the last two episodes, we understood different aspects of GDP calculations and how to interpret the data. In this episode, we are turning from core macroeconomic concepts to a very different component of our economy that touches the agricultural sector, which is MSP or minimum support prices. Agriculture, as we all know, is a very key sector to our economy, given that it employs 40% of workforce, although its share of the output is less than 20%. It also dominates news space given its connection to inflation. Thus, any story connected to the sector catches attention, whether it is locust attack, untimely rains, heat wave, farmer protests, or loan waivers. MSP is one such beast that becomes political due to its nature and impact on farmers at large. Let us understand what is the MSP? What is the objective behind setting the MSP? How is the MSP calculated and how it affects the economy? Before we get to the concept and purpose of MSP, let us first understand some peculiarities of the farming business. Now, agriculture or farming is a commodity business. Like any other commodity business, say steel or lead or copper or petrol, the output of farming is an undifferentiated product. Rice from one farm cannot be differentiated from another. But what makes farming different is the long gestation period. It does not take months for a steel plant to output steel once the process of production starts. But in the case of farming, once the process of farming starts, that is when the seed is sowed, it takes months for the output to be generated. For some commercial crops, it can even be more than a year also. And that means that a farmer takes decision on what crop to sow, how much to sow, based on the information then available. And between then and when the output is actually available for sale, a lot can change. Crop prices can change dramatically. Weather can also have an impact on the output, or some prices of inputs like fertilizers or pesticides can change dramatically in between. Sometimes governments can put restrictions on sale of certain commodities to reduce the prices of essential commodities, which takes away some of the upside for a farmer from higher prices. Effectively, a farmer is exposed to a lot of risks. The ideal economic way to mitigate this risk is through a vibrant commodity derivatives market, which constantly feeds price information back to the farmer and gives the farmer an opportunity to hedge his or her risk if he or she so desires. But this is not the case in farming. Derivatives based on farm commodities are not large, and historically, governments have looked down upon such products. They are thought to add volatility rather than curb volatility in prices. And hence, there are a lot of restrictions on what commodities can be traded and who can trade, etc. Whether that is right or wrong is a completely different discussion. It won't be wrong to say that hedging price risk through commodity derivatives is not viable for most farmers, at least in India. Another factor unique to India is that most farmers are small, living in rural areas, and are not necessarily well informed on price trends or have a great insight into future price trends. There tends to be a lot of information asymmetry between the farmer and the trader to whom he or she sells the crop. Smartphones and high speed data connections in rural areas have, to some extent, reduced this information gap, but this gap is still there and it is very large. Now, enter the MSP. One of the primary factors of the complexity in the agricultural sector is the time lag, as we have discussed. Sowing for rabi crops typically takes place in the month of November, while harvesting happens around April, and the consumption happens after few months. The period between sowing and marketing is large, and anything adverse can happen within that period. Untimely rains, heat wave, or a war can disrupt the market. An outbreak of a particular pest can also ruin the crop. In such a scenario, It is often less costly to simply dump the crop by the roadside or at a landfill. And we see this sad and unfortunate scenario every once in a while. It is to address these issues the MSP was introduced. MSP is fixed by government each year and is generally announced before the start of the sowing season. Effectively, it is meant to be a guarantee by the government to the farmers that they will receive at least the fixed MSP for their crop. We will discuss how this promise works in reality a bit later in the episode. So, what does MSP actually do? It tries to effectively fix the floor price for the crops, and hence the word minimum is there in the MSP. Now, before we get into how this price floor works, let us understand how the MSP is calculated. Now, while the MSP is announced by the government, it is fixed basis the recommendations of the Commission for Agricultural Costs and Prices, CACP. CACP is a statutory body and submits separate reports recommending prices for Kharif and Rabi crops. The central government, after considering the report and views of the state government, and also keeping in view the overall demand and supply situation in the country, takes the final decision. In most years, the prices recommended by the CACP are accepted without any changes. Now, while recommending MSPs, what are the factors that CACP considers? CACP considers important factors like cost of production, overall demand supply situation of various crops in the domestic and in world markets, domestic and international prices, intercrop price parity, terms of trade between agricultural and non-agricultural sector, likely effect of price policy on the rest of the economy, and a minimum 50% as the margin over the cost of production. MSP is fixed for 24 crops. There are 14 kharif crops, which are paddy or rice, jowar, bajra, maize, ragi, tur dal, mung dal, urad dal, cotton, groundnut, sunflower seed, soybean, sesame, and niger seed. There are seven rabi crops, which are wheat, barley, gram, lentil, rapeseed, safflower, and toria. There are few other crops also, which are copra, dehusked coconut, and jute. In case of sugarcane, fair and remunerative price or FRP is set by the government, which functions similar to the MSP. Now, let us turn to how the MSP is calculated. And for that, we will turn to our resident economist, Dviti.
Thank you, Swapnil. So let's understand this better how MSP is actually calculated. So MSP is based on the calculation of at least 1.5 times the cost of production incurred by the farmers. Now, the most important thing to know is what is the cost of production here. So there are three kinds of production cost, both at the state and all India average levels. The first one is called A2. In this type, the cost of production involves all paid out costs directly incurred by the farmer in cash and in kind on seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, hired labor, land, fuel, irrigation, and so on. The next cost is called as the A2 plus FL. It includes the value of unpaid family labor in addition to all the items from A2. So, in addition to the cost in A2, it also includes the cost of labor of the farmer and his family themselves if they're not paid explicitly in cash. So, this is kind of like an imputed cost. And the last cost, the third cost of production, is called the C2 cost. It is the most comprehensive cost that, in addition to the A2 plus FL cost, it also factors in the rentals, the interest foregone on owned lands, and the fixed capital assets of the farmer. So the A2 cost is the actual cash cost of production. The A2 plus FL cost includes the actual cash cost plus the imputed cost of labor. And the C2 cost, in addition, also includes the rent and the interest on the land and the capital assets owned by the farmer. This is also an imputed cost element. So now the ideal formula according to the committee for calculating MSP would be C2 plus 50% of C2. or we can simply say 1.5x of C2. Now, CACP considers both A2 plus FL and C2 costs while recommending the MSP. CACP reckons only A2 plus FL cost for return. However, C2 costs are used by CACP primarily as a benchmark reference cost to see if the MSPs recommended by them at least cover these costs in some of the major producing states. The initial stage is basically to collate data on the cost of cultivation in all the states for all the crops from the Ministry of Agriculture. The cost of cultivation data is gathered through surveys, which are carried out by the Cost Study Division. Costs of all inputs are stitched together into the price index. It is called the Crops Input Price Index or the CIPI. Two indices are created, one for Rabi and the other for the Kharif crops. The index includes inputs from human labor, bullock labor, machine labor, seeds, fertilizers, irrigation charges, etc. The share of the human labor in the total is one third for Rabi and half for Kharif crops. Those weights have been calculated from past year's actual cost data. Most important thing to note here is that the CIPI is calculated for the past year based on the actual data and is also projected for the next sowing season to help in projecting the MSP for the upcoming crop year. Now, using this data, the state-wise projected cost of production is then calculated for each crop. Then, based on the total production in the respective state, a weighted average projected cost of production is calculated at an all India level for each crop again. Here, the cost of production calculation is made for all three kinds, that is the A2, A2 plus FL, and C2 costs. Now, let us look at the recently approved MSPs for Rabi marketing season 2023-24. The cost of production as per A2 plus FL method for wheat projected for 23-24 year was rupees 1065 per quintal. The MSP is set to 2125 per quintal, which is more than the ideal formula of 1.5x the cost. So MSP is 100% over and above the cost in such a case. In case of safflower, the cost of production as per the A2 plus FL method was projected as rupees 3765 per quintal and the MSP was 1.5 times the cost, which is 5650. Now let's get back again to Swapnil for some more insights on this topic.
Thanks, Dviti, for this wonderful explanation. So, MSP calculation is pretty straightforward once you have the cost of production data. One aspect to highlight is that MSP is a pretty objective and straightforward system. Let us now understand how the MSP system work in practice. How and when does this MSP comes into picture once the farmer is ready to sell its produce? Now, first things first, the farmers have freedom to do anything with their output. They can use for self consumption, or sell to a private company, or a cooperative society, or sell in a regular market. A large amount of the produce is used by the farmers for their own consumption. Farmers sell their produce through various modes. In almost all of the crops, the majority of sale is through local private markets and mandis, and only a few are sold through government and cooperative agencies. Only in case of sugarcane, the majority of the sale is done through government or cooperative agencies. So, what happens is that the government itself procures different crops through various central, state, and cooperative agencies. These include Food Corporation of India, FCI, Cotton Corporation of India, Jute Corporation of India, Central Warehousing Corporation, National Agricultural Cooperative Marketing Federation of India Limited, which is NAFED or NAFED, National Consumer Cooperative Federation of India, NCCF, and Small Farmers Agri Business Consortium. Besides, state governments also appoint state agencies to undertake price support scheme PSS operations. So, let us understand how this procurement is done. FCI undertakes procurement of wheat and paddy, whereas NAFED undertakes procurement of oilseeds and pulses. Procurement of coarse cereals is done by state government agencies for a central pool as per the directions issued by the Government of India from time to time. Post the harvest, these agencies enter the market to buy the produce at the declared MSP for that crop. If the market price for that crop is lower than the MSP, obviously the farmers would want to sell as much of their produce to these agencies as is possible. And if the market price is above the MSP, the farmers would not be keen to sell their output to the agencies but would rather sell their produce in the market. And this is where the problem is. The government does not have infinite capacity to buy the produce. They cannot have the financial resources nor the warehouse capacity to buy the entire India's output at the MSP. So the government only procures part of the produce, and that too only in some states, since it does not have on the ground infrastructure for procurement in all the states. In case of wheat, Madhya Pradesh, Haryana, and Punjab, which drives almost half of India's wheat output, account for around 80% of total procurement. We observe similar concentration in rice too. In terms of crops, it is primarily wheat and rice where procurement happens in sufficient enough quantities to influence the market price. In case of crops like pulses or coarse cereals, the MSP has practically little relevance. According to a recent study by CRISIL, of the 14 kharif crops covered under MSP, only paddy and cotton saw a meaningful procurement during the past 3 years, with 45% for paddy and 27% of cotton output were procured at MSP. But when it comes to groundnuts, it was only 4 to 5% of the production, and for pulses, it was even less than that. However, certain measures are being taken. A few states like Punjab and Rajasthan in the last couple of years have mandated everyone to purchase agricultural produce at MSP or above. Anyone who compels farmers to sell their produce below MSP can be imprisoned or fined. We won't debate on whether such laws are required or not, but we can definitely say that if MSP is to be used as a tool to increase farmers' income, which it is, then the procurement mechanism needs to be strengthened. Otherwise, the MSP remains a statement of intent but of a little practical relevance in several crops. Not only that, but efforts in communicating MSPs or creating awareness around that are also required. Recent studies have shown that around 20% of farmers on average are aware of MSPs, with significant variation across states and crops. Lastly, there is an ongoing debate about the need for MSP and the large procurement network. There are periodic discussions over whether we can simply move to a DBT or direct benefit transfer framework for farmers and let markets decide the prices rather than the government come in and distort them through the MSP. There is also the issue of whether a vibrant futures market will do a better job of protecting farmers' income than the MSP. These are all valid debates and a topic for a subsequent episode. But we hope this episode gave you some perspective on what is the MSP, how it is calculated, and what is the practical relevance. Thank you for listening this and see you soon with another exciting topic the next week.
And that concludes this episode. I hope you liked it. Your hosts today were Swapnil and Viti. If you did like this episode, please subscribe and share this with others who you think might be interested. If you have any feedback or suggestions as to what topics we should cover, do drop us a line at podcast@indiadatahub.com. See you next week. This is Ashutosh, the co-founder of India Data Hub, signing out.